it. I mean, who's all going to join now? There's already one person. We see who's that person.
It's okay. We can postpone. It's fine for us. But I'm just worried about your student or audience. You know, they have to be here. It's fine. Okay.
It's all right. We go. Okay. Good evening, colleagues from. Good evening, colleagues from South Africa. Good evening, colleagues from. Good afternoon, colleagues from Missouri, Illinois, and Kent and the Netherlands. It's lovely to have you join us on this webinar with Morehouse College. UWC and Morehouse College through the International Office and the Center for Global Partnerships have partnered to be able to deepen our own engagement with each other. And so we're really very pleased to be able to have this startup session for us as a community. I want to, UWC, University of Western Cape, has a long history of anti-apartheid struggle, and similarly, there's a tradition and a strong tradition that Morehouse has. Morehouse College has in attending to issues around civil rights, which Jan will talk about a little later. So it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, and we plan to do several more of these as we deepen our engagement with each other. Given the importance we have, it's the 26th. Tomorrow for us will be the Freedom Day, which in 1994, the first time that all the South African participants in this webinar had a chance to vote for democratic South Africa. And so that vote, that enfranchisement is really, really important for us, given the struggle we had against apartheid. And similarly, these same struggles are ones that now we have seen in the US, given the shift from the Trump supremacist right-wing administration to a different way of being now, and that it brings with it its own kinds of joys, but also challenges, which Prof. Karim from South Africa will be chatting about, and that our two speakers, Adrian Jones and Jalen Curry, will be able to share more with us. Jan, I'll hand over to you.
Good afternoon, or I guess it's good afternoon for all of us. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really delighted to begin this partnership with the University of the Western Cape. We're really delighted because this is an opportunity for us to begin to understand the parallels, the similarities, the differences between our two institutions and our countries, and to see that the challenges that we face in the US are shared by especially people of color in other countries. And so we're really delighted to begin this partnership. We started with voting and voting rights because this is such an acutely important issue right now in the United States. And the histories, though very, very different in terms of the acquisition of voting rights for people of color in the two countries, are both interesting and again have many parallels. Morehouse College was founded in 1867. It is a historically Black college. It is one of about 100 historically Black colleges in the US, and is the only historically Black college that serves men only. Morehouse has a rich history around social justice and leadership. Our most famous alum is Martin Luther King Jr., but we have many, many alum who have contributed to civil rights and social justice and leadership. We consider Morehouse a leadership incubator. And so we really believe that the work that we do is all about developing our students to lead in whatever field they choose. And so we're just delighted to be here today. And I'm so pleased that we're able to start this relationship. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Jan. Lovely comments. And our historically black universities, UWC and Morehouse College are both that. And so given the focus on social justice that we both have and the struggle for black rights, I think it's just appropriate for us to kick off the session with a welcome to Deborah Lamson, introduction to her. Deborah's our UWC International Office head honcho on study abroad. She leads on that for us. Deborah, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and add whatever you need, and then Prof. Karim.
Thank you very much, Umesh and Dr. Adams. First of all, greetings to all and a warm welcome. It is still a summer year with us. From across the world, I guess you're all in different time zones. And so it's either good morning or good evening or midday. And whether you have your lunch or your coffee, please enjoy it. We are all connected to engage on a very specific topic this evening, for me this evening. And this webinar, which as Umesh has indicated, would be the first of a series of intellectual engagements that we will explore and issues of democracy and leadership, and to pursue the pursuit of justice. As is introduced, Umesh has already done that. I'm Deborah Lamson. I've been employed in the International Relations Office for 22 years. That's a long time. I coordinate student mobility and exchange abroad, and that is my passion for now. I guess as I develop more in internationalization, I will learn more or acquire more other skills to other passions. And let's see what that boils down to in the next few years. The University of the Western Cape is a very young university, like most of us around here now. The university just celebrated 60 years of hope, action, and knowledge, and that is what we want to share this evening. The University of the Western Cape is situated in Bellville, in a suburb in Cape Town, South Africa. And I guess for a tourism, this is the most attractive tourist spot to come to. And as we engage this topic of this webinar this evening, like we have in our university saying from hope to action, hope, enfranchisement and voter suppression in South Africa and the United States is the topic of this evening. And it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Professor Abdurazak, also known as Razak Karim from the University of the Western Cape. Professor Razak, and if you don't mind, I haven't learned it by heart, I would have to read it. Professor Abdurazak Karim is professor and acting director of the Institute of Social Development at the University of the Western Cape. Razak Karim obtained his PhD in City and Regional Planning from Cornell University, New York, and prior to joining the Institution for Social Development at UWC, he taught in the Department of City and Regional Development at Cornell University and in the Growth and Structure of City Programs at Morehouse College in Philadelphia. He also worked for the Department of Land Affairs and Land Reform and Rural Development and at the Department of Constitutional Development on provisional and local governance. His research interests are in urban and rural development, the role of social movements in promoting development of from below, as well as urban sustainability and climate change. He has researched and written on the Brazilian landless movements, struggles for land reform, and an ecologically sustainable rural development model. Professor Karim, I hope I did justice to your brief resume that we have, and I hand over to you now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Debbie, for that introduction. So I'm gonna just share my presentation. Where is it now? Okay, so let me go up. So the presentation, Hope, Enfranchisement and Voter Suppression, South Africa and the US. So there are a number of commonalities and difference between South Africa and the US. The, the fight for enfranchisement has been a long one in both the US and in South Africa. And primarily it was due to grassroots mobilization through the civil rights movement and other movements in the US, as well as the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And but yet, when I look at voter suppression and enfranchisement, there are also some differences that I want to highlight with the US context, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So we see that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a key instrument in unblocking the legal barriers that prevented Americans from exercising their right to vote. I won't speak much on the US case, just highlighting it to provide some context. But in recent decades, we have noticed how states have passed a series of suppression measures around stricter voting IDs, cutting voting times, restricting registration, and purging voter rolls throughout across the US. And in South Africa, sort of 1994 is sort of a key point in the fight for enfranchisement, or it sort of culminated with the first democratic elections and the end of apartheid. And in both cases, the US and South Africa, people lost their lives as they tried to promote access to the vote. So in South Africa, voter suppression is not a major problem, but we have noticed a steady decline in the number of people who vote. For example, in 1994, 86% of all registered voters cast their vote. However, in 2019, only 49%. So we see a sudden decline. And so the issue that I will try and highlight a little bit later is, why has that been the case? And what does it raise for both South Africa and the US? Voter turnout is seen as a key indicator of the vitality of democracy. And of course, high voter turnout is seen as a marker of an enthusiastic and politically engaged electorate, while a lower voter turnout is generally associated with voter apathy and mistrust of the political process. And so in this regard, the decline of voter participation in South Africa highlights some key questions about the quality of civic engagement and citizen involvement in democratic politics, and a mistrust in the political system. And I will kind of point out a bit later, so while apathy is usually held up as a key part of why it is a decline in voter participation, I will show that actually there's a greater mistrust in the political system. That's also a key factor that we need to take consideration of. So when we sort of look from this picture, is a picture taken in Soweto in 1994 on 27th April. And people lined up to vote for the very first time. And so it created sort of a sense of hope in what was to come. And of course, we see Nelson Mandela casting his first vote, and people throughout the length and breadth of South Africa, from the villages to the small rural town to the major urban centers, people.
Apology, Razak.
Yes. Can you see me? Yeah. Hello? Umesh?
Yes, it's all fine. You can continue, Prof.
Oh, okay. I just, so, okay, so we move forward. I will just, so tomorrow we celebrate Freedom Day, 27th April. And it's a day that we commemorate the first non-racial post-apartheid elections. And it sort of signifies the enfranchisement of Black South Africans who were denied the right to vote over many decades and centuries. And April 27th, Freedom Day, signaled the hope of a better life for all. That was the slogan of the ANC in 1994. And rooted in this whole idea of the better life for all was the Reconstruction and Development Plan or program, where rural people made an input into what it is that they wanted to see in the post-apartheid South Africa and the new South Africa. Women made inputs into the plan as to what they would want to see, urban movements, and so forth. And so in a sense, there was a sign or a hope that there will be, unlike the apartheid period, that there will be greater involvement of people in determining the future of their neighborhoods as well as the country. And so why the decline in voting? Stephen Friedman wrote an interesting article where he basically says South Africa remains a nation of insiders and outsiders 27 years after democracy. And in a sense, he highlights how first there has been material improvements in 1994, yet poverty inequality is still high. There's a 40% unemployment rate, food insecurity is very high, almost 49% of South Africans live below the poverty line, 26% of South Africans lack access to food, and a further 20% are in danger of falling into food insecurity. And so we have what Friedman speaks about as the insiders and the outsiders. So the insiders benefit economically while the outsiders do not have access to the basic necessities, such as schooling, good quality schooling, housing, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, apathy is often held up as the reason for declining voting. However, a disenchantment with the current political process that favors insiders is also been a major component of why there has been this decline. People feel that they have not benefited. So there are movements such as the Brazilian landless movement, not the Brazilian, sorry, the landless people's movement of South Africa, came up with along with the shack dwellers movement and the Western Cape anti-eviction campaign, they came up with a slogan of no land, no house, no vote campaign. And essentially, they were arguing that we have voted since 1994, but we have not seen real material improvement in our lives. People still live in shacks, and people want to say, how do we change that? And this vote was sort of a protest campaign to say that, one, we can't eat the vote. It's a very common refrain in South Africa. People say, oh, we have the vote, but people will then respond by saying, we can't eat the vote. How have things changed for us? Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, things have improved, but for the vast majority, particularly Black and so-called colored communities, that has not really been the case. So while the campaign was not successful and it was criticized by many people from both the left and the right, it raised particular questions about how outsiders speak on behalf of the poor or the outsiders. Sorry, how insiders speak about on behalf of the poor or the outsiders, but also it raises particular questions about the nature of democracy and the whole idea of enfranchisement to what end. And it raised the questions about what was that hope of 1994? Why is it not reaching so many more people? And so it raises particular issues around the nature of representative versus substantive democracy in South Africa. So sort of the Nelson Mandela Foundation sort of captures as well when it says that it can be argued that some have never seen the freedom that we pride ourselves on. When 2.2 million people are missing a meal a day, a meal every day, and 1 in 15 children die before their 5th birthday due to malnutrition, we must ask where those conversations disappear to when we stand in fury at an injustice. Of course, the Nelson Mandela Foundation did not support this campaign. I'm just highlighting it as a point to illustrate that there's a widespread concern around the nature of South African democracy and what voting is and what it means to celebrate the end of apartheid and what it is that we want to see in the future. So sort of deepening the content of enfranchisement. So the decline of voting in South Africa raises key questions about the need to, I cannot see, deepen the democratic process, especially for the outsiders. And of course, it speaks about the need to reduce the power of the outsiders. For example, we saw in the US, some figures I came across, it cost $14 billion just to run the 2020 election. Probably the figures are higher. And in South Africa, it was over 1 billion rand. And so in a sense, we see how elections have become sort of, in a sense, a mean for the insiders to really maintain a particular way of organizing society. And so the need then is, how do we move from a representative process of voting, of democracy, of voting every 5 years, to a substantive one where voters are not simply passive, but active citizens who can exercise an active role in carrying out the political affairs of the neighborhoods, the cities, the states, and the countries. And of course, this will vary in different places, but how do we move away from this process of having the vote, but also moving to deepening the content of that vote? And I'll sort of just round off by saying, in a sense, the New Georgia project, of which more will come, I'm sure, has shown how outsiders can become more informed and engaged voters, as has been done over a number of years by people like Tracy Abrams and others, linked to ways of ensuring fighting against voter suppression and engaging for the enfranchisement, deepening the enfranchisement of ordinary people. In South Africa, we had a similar process where in the pre-1994 period, we had street committees, block committees, where people would discuss issues of the day. And so the challenge in South Africa is, how do we get to this process where we can deepen democracy, so we can give content to the vote? So it's not just a question where we come every 5 years and vote, and the lived experiences of ordinary people around access to housing, access to food, preventing people dying before the age of 5. Stunting is a major problem in South Africa. So how do we do that? And so to promote substantive democracy will not be easy, but the civil rights movements and the anti-apartheid movement and struggles have shown that it is possible. And I think going forward, if we are to look at the question of enfranchisement, how do we go to a process where we can ensure that hope is not simply raised, but it's actually carried through over time? And if we look at the two contexts, South Africa and the US, we see there's the efforts to undermine voting rights in the US, primarily through in states that are controlled by the Republicans. And in South Africa, we face a slightly different problem. We have the vote. There's no real efforts to undermine the vote, but we're also witnessing how there's been a decline of civic engagement and decline of voting. And if we are to sort of move forward to realizing the dreams people fought for, people like Nelson Mandela and others who gave their lives for freedom and the right to vote, but also a right to vote in a substantive way, we will have to kind of find ways and means to kind of deepen democracy. And I think I'll stop at that point. Oops.
Thank you very much, Prof. Karim. Appreciate your insights. I'm handing over immediately to Prof. Shin. Prof. Shin, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here and learn from everyone across the oceans about this important issue. As Martin Luther King said, voting is a foundation stone for political action, which I put behind me. I wonder if everyone can see. So as an immigrant, I am eager to better understand this democratic foundation stone voting. So today we are very lucky, very fortunate to have experts to discuss in depth voter suppression, enfranchisement, and hope on two continents. I put empowerment, enfranchisement, and hope, and because I feel hope is really what we are fighting for. And as such expert, I'm introducing to you here is Dr. Adrian Jones. Dr. Jones holds 2 degrees, a PhD in political sciences from CUNY Graduate Center. CUNY is a city university of New York, and a JD from UC Berkeley. And I don't know how she did it. Dr. Jones, how do you do it? The 2 degrees, how do you have time to study that much? And
that was plenty of time.
Okay, that's wonderful. You know, I admire you so much. And her PhD dissertation titled "The Voting Rights Act Under Siege: The Development of the Influence of Colorblind Conservatism and the Federal Government and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's really long title, but it's so pertinent for today's topic. She is the expert on this issue. Dr. Jones' research focuses on the history and politics of Black Americans, as well as on legal and public policy issues related to Black experience. She is currently teaching courses in American politics, race and law. She is also a fellow at Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership. We are very happy to have you here. In addition, and when I do research, I found out that Dr. Jones is a public intellectual. She is a regular contributor to US newspapers on issues of race and politics. And she's indeed an expert on this issue. So without further ado, Dr. Jones, please, the floor is yours or the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not a big PowerPoint user, but I thought I would use one today. Can everyone see that? Can I make it work? Oh, it can only be big if I can't see my screen.
That looks great.
It does, but now I can't see my notes. Nonetheless, I only have 12 minutes. Let me turn the timer on. Okay, fantastic. So I wanted to talk about voting suppression in the United States. And one of the main questions that I keep being asked in interviews recently is whether or not it is accurate to call what is happening right now Jim Crow 2.0. And I would argue that the answer to that question is yes. And the reason that I would say that is because the Jim Crow laws that emerged in the late 1880s were intentional and reactionary, and they were based on a big lie. So states, of course, we had a civil war. In fact, in large part over the enslavement of Black people in the United States. And at the end of the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction during which the then Republican Party adopted a number of constitutional amendments, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection and due process for people in their states, and the 15th Amendment to extend the franchise to Black men. And people took advantage of these opportunities. And in 1877, when the two then parties, Democrats and Republicans, same titles, different parties, made a compromise that the Republican Party would remove military occupation of the South, and the Southern Democrats would be happy with that in exchange for giving the Republicans the presidential role in the 1876 election, which had been a tie, and so it required some compromise. As a result of the end of the Reconstruction period, There was a little bit of time lapse in between then in the late 1880s when states like Georgia began to pass Jim Crow laws. And these laws were reactionary, right? They were a reaction to the fact that Black men could now vote. They were running for office, participating in everything from the national government to local offices. And so they selected a slate of provisions that allowed to pointedly keep Black people from the polls. So we're talking about poll taxes in a situation where Black people were economically depressed and did not have property. We're talking about grandfather clauses where you could not vote if your grandfather could not vote. Well, your grandfather was a slave, so you certainly couldn't vote. We're talking about literacy and understanding tests with a population that was prevented from learning to read. We're talking about economic and physical violence like lynching. On my notes, I had some notes about how many lynchings there were between 1882 and 1968. There were about 5,000. The vast majority of those were of Black people. And I'm calling economic violence the violence that occurs to you theoretically when you are living perhaps in a rural area. Georgia is very rural, and you attempt to access the polls to register or to vote, and you come to find that you are no longer employed, or you no longer have an opportunity to sharecrop in your local community. And this is a great state to be speaking about this from, because as the former director of the Southern American Civil Liberties Union has written in his very good book on the history of voter suppression in the state of Georgia, the state of Georgia was not unique as Southern states, and it employed all of the mechanisms that we think about. And not listed on this list are interesting ways to apportion the electorate, like the county unit system, which was significant in Georgia, and white primaries, which prevent Black people from participating in the selection of candidates for election. So this Jim Crow period lasted for about 100 years. And in 1965, of course, we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which instituted something called preclearance, so that states were unable to pass voting laws unless they were vetted by the Department of Justice. And this meant that many of the kinds of laws that were on the list that I just showed you were not passed because they would have to be evaluated by the federal government before they could become enacted. Unfortunately, in 2013, in the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, the court decided that the formula, which is section 4 on this chart, that identified the states that would be covered by this preclearance provision in section 5 was no longer constitutional. And because no states were then covered by section 4, section 5 remains, but it can't do any work. So it's not protecting us from the kinds of provisions that we heard about in Professor Kareem's talk, like the voter ID laws that began in about the mid-2000s. So let's also note that in the mid-1990s, the Republican Party seems to have come to the decision that they were not going to attempt to bring Black voters into the GOP. Instead, they were going to start to try to prevent people from voting so that they could select their own voters. So you start to see them organizing around these voter ID and similar laws. So it's voter ID laws, which are deeply limiting the ability of people to identify themselves at the polls easily. They can no longer do that. They have to have specific types of ID that statistically Black people, older people, young people don't necessarily have. Of course, these demographics also tend to vote Democratic. And so the GOP is interested in limiting those voters. So they start passing voter IDs, purging the voting rolls, closing polling places, coming up with unique measures like exact match in the state of Georgia, which prevents a vote in 2018 if your name doesn't match exactly what is on the rolls due to a typo or a hyphen or some other kind of very simple inappropriate problem. So in 2013, of course, as a result of that Shelby decision, these voter ID laws proliferate. And so we get even more voter identification laws. We have recently seen the election of our first Black president, which in response in our nation has resulted in the rise of the right. The rise again of obvious white supremacy, which had really become more neutralized and less not politically correct. So people were less likely to express their white supremacist views. That has changed since Obama became the president, and it accelerated once President Trump came into office and really used that energy with his base to upset people. And starting in the mid-1990s, President Trump is also helping to fuel this new big lie, which is that voter fraud is rampant in the United States and that elections are being stolen, in particular by the Democratic Party. And so something has to be done. Voter ID laws, voter purges, all of these kinds of closures and limitations on the right to vote are appropriate because otherwise the Democrats are gonna steal the elections. And so we see this rise in white supremacy and in the idea that voters are no longer confident in the election and that we need to pass additional laws in order to make sure that there is confidence. So very interestingly, of course, in 2020, we have a very unique election where, I can't stop sharing, where turnout is massive nationwide and in the state of Georgia. Our new president, Biden, who's Democrat, of course, won the presidential election. And then we had 2 Senate races where both of the Democratic candidates for the Senate races won those races. This upset the president. He sued in a number of states over the election results. He complained to our Secretary of State on a recorded call that he needed 11,780 additional votes and threatened the Secretary of State with criminal prosecution and his attorney as a result. And he encouraged the state, of course, to violate the people's choice for who they had selected in these offices where they were Democrats. They were really okay with the Republican wins, but they were not happy with the Democratic wins. The Georgia race was actually, the presidential count was actually done 3 times. The Secretary of State announced to the world and the public that the election was fair and run properly. And of course, we now have President Biden. Immediately, the state leadership in our state began to come up with a new slate of voting laws that we now know as SB 202. And very similar to the Jim Crow laws, these provisions are designed and aimed at urban voters, Black voters, and urban areas are where Black people tend to live in the United States. The youth vote, the elderly vote, again, marginalized voters and also voters who tend to vote Democratic. So we see, for example, oh, and I have to mention that as a result of the pandemic, the state really did try to expand access. So absentee voting was available, early vote days were luxurious, voting hours were set so that people could actually access the polls. Applications for absentee ballots were widespreadly sent out. And people took advantage of this and it increased their voting power on top of the power of Stacey Abrams and others motivating people to get out and vote. Under SB 202, we see all of these things attacked. The number of early voting days have been reduced. The amount of time to request and send out absentee ballots is reduced. Absentee ballots can't be sent out without request. So you can't just get it in the mail and send it in. The ID requirement, which Republicans say is the same as for in-person voting, but if you ask me, I'll explain to you why, even though the ID requirements appear to be the same, they absolutely are not. There are strict limitations now on line warming. We have long lines in Georgia. It is, inappropriate not to be able to give people food and water while they are in the lines. There are limits on weekend voting. So counties have the ability to choose whether or not they're going to do Sunday voting. And we do souls to the polls on Sundays. They know that this is the day when Black people get out to vote. The state has the power now to take over precincts. And they have demoted the Secretary of State and changed the state election board so that it is state legislative run. I see I'm running up against my time. The bottom line is that, in my opinion, these laws are very similar to the kinds of laws that were passed during Jim Crow. They're intentional, they're reactionary, they're based on a big lie. What we are going to have to do coming in the future is what we did in 2020, which is manage with these rules and make sure our folks get out, get the vote out, and are able to participate in a democratic environment. I have dedicated myself to codifying my talk and putting it on our faculty blog. So you'll be able to take a look more slowly at the voluminous information that I'm trying to get across. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. I would like to, in advance, invite you to a longer session where we would be able to have you. And in fact, I think it'll be just wonderful if you could, when you are able to travel, come to South Africa with your Morehouse colleagues, and we, put a symposium or a webinar or a symposium or a small conference that brings the intellectual input from both sides to address the growing movement to the right that is trying to suppress human rights globally. So thank you very much.
Done. I am dying to come. I am dying to teach, and I am dying to learn. My dad actually worked on, at the end of apartheid, on you all's reconciliation, and
on the TRC, yes.
To come during this time period and do something.
Well, let's make it happen as we plan forward. Thank you very much for your input. Janine, over to you.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. My name is Janine White. I'm a staff member in the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership at Morehouse College, and I serve as the Study Abroad Program Coordinator in the Office of International Education. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome our next presenter, Mr. Jalen Curry. Mr. Curry is a sophomore political science and urban studies double major at Morehouse College from Rock Hill, South Carolina. He is a presidential ambassador to the college, as well as a King Legacy Scholar. He is a member of several campus organizations and clubs, including the New Deal Democrats, an organization devoted to demystifying the democratic process while encouraging student engagement. And he currently serves as the organization's president. Mr. Curry is a fellow with both the Democratic Party of Georgia and the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Additionally, he has worked on several campaigns, including Reverend Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff, and the Biden-Harris ticket. Mr. Curry, welcome, and we thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you. And in Morehouse fashion, I just have to introduce myself. So my name is Jalen Curry. I am a sophomore political science and urban studies double major from Rock Hill, South Carolina. And I do currently serve as the president of the New Deal Democrats. So first, I just want to begin this to explain what exactly the New Deal Democrats do. The New Deal Democrats were founded in 2018 by Julian Hemmings, who has now gone on to graduate school to do other things. And we're devoted to demystifying the process of voting. So between the years of 2018 and 2020, about 15 million people turned of age. So 15 million people became eligible to vote. And we came together and we started to think about just how hard it is to make it seem like, to vote. So for young people in this country, especially I would say people aged between about 18 and 29, we have essentially been disconnected from the civil rights movement. We think that it is some ancient process that happened years ago, because in our textbooks, these images are in black and white. So, it is essentially, we feel as if, or not say we, but the feeling is that, this is something that happened a long time ago, and we don't face those things that they faced then. So this organization was founded to essentially bring young people back into the democratic process. Our current president is around 78 years old, and I am 20 years. And I'm 20 years old, so that is about, I can't do quick math, but I mean, that's a seizable gap. So we as a young generation feel as if it is important for our voices to be heard in the society and the system that we live in currently. So in order to do that, we want to get people involved. And of course, the course of 2020, the effort to bring out the vote has been something that we've never seen. I mean, you've had institutions that normally try to stay out of politics, putting voting on the forefront. The NFL, which is the National Football League, is something that a lot of Black men, a lot of Black families watch religiously. And they were telling people to vote on Sundays. The NBA was telling people to vote every Thursday. So you had a communal effort to bring out the vote. And what our organization wants to do is, and what we currently do is, we want to explain the importance of why you should vote. So on my time on the campaign trail, my focus was on voters aged 18 to 21, which would be first-time voters. And one of the questions that I got a lot was, why should I vote? And honestly and truly, that is the question that I love to hear, because that shows me that we are not just willing to give up our vote just because you have a good game. We want to know why do you deserve our vote? And as I heard on this panel before, we've come to see that in actuality, in a lot of cases, our situation has not improved since the 1960s. And, we are starting to ask those questions. We've been voting this way for over 60 years, and yet we still find ourselves in the same position. So what is it that we're voting for? Why do you want our vote? And that's a question that I encourage a lot of young people to ask. And honestly, I feel as if withholding your vote is a form of protest, because you are showing that you have to earn this. This is something that is sacred to me, so I'm not just going to give it away to you. And on the topic of activism, we are an organization that wants to promote activism, but we want everyone to understand that activism does not look like one thing. Activism is not just in the streets. Activism is also in the courtroom. Activism is in the operating room. We need Black people and people of color to be active in every area of our society, because unfortunately we are oppressed in every area of our society. And on the topic of voting rights, Black Americans have historically voted one way since we've had the right to vote. And now we're dealing with the generation of thinkers. And, we ask always question, you could say something and our follow-up question is going to be why. And, the older generation in this country, they kind of diss in between it. It's like, why? Like, I'm just telling you to do it. Trust me. We want to know why. Why should I do it? Give me a reason. I'm going to give you the reasons why I shouldn't, so you should give me the reasons why I should. And in that, we have seen true action. And as a result of that, we have SB 202, which is a direct attack on, young people. For example, one of my great colleagues, Rick Hart, who is also very involved in the process, in 2020, so coming up, we have the governor's election in Georgia, which we plan to do the same thing that we did before. And we already have people that are willing to be arrested for handing out water bottles in line. So our generation has this attitude of, it's not rebellion, it's our right. Like, this is what we're going to do. And you can support us or you're not, but we're going to do that. And over the course of the summer, the unfortunate events that happened to George Floyd, really ignited the true flame across young Americans and across the world. I think that is the utmost demonstration of the collective power of people aged 18 through 29. I mean, amidst a global pandemic, amidst online school, we still came together and demonstrated our power. So they're scared, and rightfully so, because I think, we're a generation that essentially, we want to be the last generation to face these things. So we don't want another civil rights movement 10 years from now or 25 years from now. Essentially, I don't want my children to be out in the streets protesting, because we want to get this thing done now. And I've talked to some people about, why this has happened. So I use my father as an example. When he was growing up in Georgia, they were not told to be overly expressive. They were not told to, go out there and stand up for what you believe. They were told to, follow the rules, mind your business, stay out the way. And I think you have a generation of people that are just very overtly passionate about the things that they love to do. And they want people to feel what they have felt. We have educated ourselves over the course of, 4 or 5 years about the things that happen, truly about the things that happen, because we learned that in necessarily school, you don't necessarily get the entire truth. So we have provided materials. We have, encouraged people to talk and ask questions. And I think that, what we've come up with is that people have their own opinions and they're rightfully entitled to it. And we just want to, amplify the voices of, people who are, in a sense, scared to speak up. And going forward, the New Democrats, the last election cycle, we invited candidates to our campus to speak with the students. And Dr. Jones, asked those hard questions that they don't necessarily get asked. And the students really like that, because we want to see the real answers, because we are real people and our lives are being affected in a real manner. And coming up, President Biden will actually be in Atlanta on Thursday, the 29th, to celebrate his 100th day in office. And on that day, there are going to be some people that are going to ask him some hard questions. You said you were going to do this in your first 100 days, and we don't necessarily see that. So I think that moving forward, we have a generation of voters and we have a generation of active individuals who will hold the system accountable truly for what it is. And it may be uncomfortable conversations. It may be some polarizing ideas, but we are devoted to getting true change out of this movement.
The appropriate thing to say would be Amandla, power to the people. Very nicely said, Jalen. Your passion, commitment, and sort of vision in working in the trenches is absolutely wonderful and laudable. I'm going to put it open to the Jan. I'm going to hand over to the floor. And then let's also start a little bit with some of the, one of the comments in that Annelies Verdulag, our colleague from Belgium, says that in Belgium, voting is compulsory. Is this a preferable system in your opinion? Would it be a solution for the challenges the political system is facing in South Africa these days with respect to voting apathy? And I imagine the same in the US. Annelies? And panelists, you feel free to unmute and connect.
I got to speak with an Australian outlet recently, and he was teaching me about compulsory voting in Australia. And he asked a similar question, why don't you guys do that? You could have some low penalty for not voting. The whole point of American, the organization of our democracy, being based in white supremacy, is to prevent people from democratically being able to vote. If we really look at how the system works, the states run elections, and this ability to limit people to vote is a part of the state's rights. So they have no interest, as we can see from SB 202, in releasing that power, right? That is a power that gives them the ability to control elections when they have the opportunity. And I didn't get to say, for example, that in 2020, you know, Raffensperger and Kemp came off looking pretty good, but like they tried to suppress the vote, it just didn't work, right? So they got in trouble with Trump. It's super messy. Trump isn't even happy with SB 202, but absolutely not are you gonna get states to agree to compulsory voting. That's out. As an option in the United States until we grow through folks like Mr. Curry and his compatriots who perhaps will encourage a more robust democratic system.
Perhaps an extended question there, Dr. Jones, is, you know, we a little confused in the South, and I imagine elsewhere in Europe, about your electoral college system, which is a proportional voting over a long period of time, and that's it. It's sort of, it's older than the mountains, and we don't have a similar process here. I mean, I think it's really archaic. Here, it's one person, one vote, and you that vote counts for what the democratic process is. Our difficulty here is also that we are also voting for parties, and the parties then determine who, given the number of people votes they get, how many seats they have in parliament. And so it's not necessarily you're voting for a person, but you're voting for a party. And I think there's a fair amount of push to have that changed in South Africa, so that given the past 10 years of kleptocracy and corruption with the past president and his party standing strongly behind him, which has changed now with Cyril Ramaphosa. So, you know, there is one to look at how the integrity and quality of a candidate who's representing the will of the people, rather than the will of the bank balance or the donors, that this is something that is also a continuing struggle that we in South Africa have. I want to ask you both, just the audience. We've scheduled to end at 6, and I want to ask your indulgence, and if you can just put a thumbs up sign or send something in the message, whether we can take a little bit more time, having our panelists here to chat about these important to deepen the conversation, whether we can extend to another 15 minutes, and if you need to leave, that's how it is. But I think while we have our presenters here, let's see whether we can steal a few minutes into the lunch. Would that be all right, colleagues? Okay, great. Annalise, I think you had a follow-up question that came from how in the rise of the right wing in the conversation in the webinar that you had the other day. Hi, Margaret, thank you very much. I appreciate your presence here. Take care. Just what are the conditions where there is pushing continually for the right to grow? We know that it was a backlash against Black leadership and leadership that is anti-oppressive, maybe still pro-capitalist, but what's been the experience now? Because in our conversations here, it does sound like one of the things that we really need to do very strongly across the continents, and this is also something I wanted to ask Jalen, is that there's a need for connecting to solidarity struggles across the globe. In the South, the climate change issues are everywhere, and that we sometimes get pressured quite a lot to have a regional response. South Africa for South Africans. In 1994, while we were celebrating our freedom, where Debbie and I and Graham had a chance to vote for the first time as Black people, at the same time in Rwanda, there was the beginning of a genocide, and it didn't even register on my radar. Now it's on our continent, and the oppressiveness is across the continent, across the globe. What's your thoughts on that, colleagues? And Annalise, Jan, will you also come in if you wish? Dr. Jones?
So
Okay. I'll leave it to Jalen. Why don't you kick off?
yeah, so I think that that's something that, the beauty of social media. I think that honestly and truly, our generation has truly learned to empathize with Black struggle across the world. And unfortunately, to the successfulness of anti-Blackness, we've kind of, pertained our own struggle to like personal. So it's like, the struggle that people are facing in Africa, African Americans have necessarily said, like, that's not our problem. Like, we have our own struggles. And I think in that, we are losing the collective fight. So for example, over the events of the summer with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it was just one of the most inspirational things to see people in Germany, to see people in, Korea. And I think that honestly and truly, to see the overt support across the country for a cause that we know that people directly are not affected by, it honestly and truly, I think it amplified and it strengthened the voices here. And also to the SARS, the movement to end SARS, we empathize and we also strategize and we, kind of attest to the different struggles that Black people face throughout the country. So I do think that in the future, the more collectively we are, I think the better that we will all be. Because Martin Luther King quoted, I forgot the quote, so sorry.
It's okay.
Here is a threat to injustice everywhere. Don't quote me on that. But I think that's honestly and truly true. Until Black people across the entire diaspora are not doing well, then you can't use Black people doing well one place as true justice.
Razak, you want to come in here just to chat about the anti-oppressive perspective and the Black consciousness perspective in movement?
Can you just repeat the question around?
No, so sorry, Razak. Jalen was talking about we following a thread of solidarity among oppressed people right across the world, and use the example of South Africa, the US, and I wanted you to just see if you wanted to share something around how the collective struggles of Black people across the world, and in some places oppressed people. If we look at those who don't have power, just what your thoughts are around that kind of a sense of solidarity across the continents.
So if we look at the anti-apartheid struggle, it was an international struggle. It was the fight for dignity, the fight not just to vote but to live a better life. So I think if we are to make any change, we have to support struggles across countries. And I think the support that we receive from the Black Power movement, if we look at, say, the Black Consciousness movement, it drew very strongly on the Black Power movement from the US, as well as from the Pan-Africanist movement throughout Africa. So Steve Biko and others drew very strongly. So the very struggle against apartheid and the right to vote emerged from this international struggles. And I think it is incumbent upon us here in South Africa, as well as elsewhere, to support the struggles in the US, where there are such blatant attempts to suppress the vote. So I think if we are to make any change anywhere, it has to be there has to be a recognition that our struggle is the same struggles elsewhere. And in that sense, it is through that level of solidarity that we can actually make some change. And I just want to go back to a question that Annalise raised around the compulsory voting. So it's an interesting question because Brazil has exactly the same thing, the compulsory vote. And actually, you need to, if you're going to be out of town, you must give a reason why you don't vote, otherwise you get fined and all those kinds of things. And I think it may or may not address, I can't say, but if I look at, say, Brazil, it gets people to vote, but it doesn't sort of come back to that level of level of engagement of deepening democracy that I was speaking about earlier. Is how do we ensure that we don't just vote, but actually meet the basic needs, you know? So how do we create that hope about our lives will improve? So it's not something reduced to the vote. So I think maybe it would be a good thing for South Africa, but I think if we can bring that together to kind of that grassroots mobilizations that took place during the anti-apartheid period to deepen it, so it's not just a status process of voting, but also an engaged process, then I think it could work. So I think maybe it's something that would be helpful, but in and of itself, I don't think it will necessarily resolve the question. People will then vote. Basically, you're removing the question, the term apathy or mistrust in the system to force people to vote. So it may help, but I think joined together with a level of grassroots mobilization and agency, we can give content to the vote.
So I have a question I'd like to ask. I
Go
put
ahead,
into the chat the question about the Electoral College and was really interested in that. But as I think about this and listen to Jalen and Dr. Jones and to Dr. Curry, I'm really wondering about what issues there might be that there could be sort of national and international consensus around pushing forward. So as I listen to Jalen, I feel like he's talking to me. I'm one of the people who say, just vote. Let's get a little bit better than what we have now. And sort of, you know, this sense of sort of compromising in order to make small improvements over time. And I hear him saying, no, people are going to be accountable to us. We have expectations. And so I'm wondering what it is that we can rally around. What are the issues that we could rally around that could help us move forward with really younger people taking the lead in identifying where we need to go? And that's to all the panelists, all three. And Jalen, Dr. Jones has her hand up. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Can I just say something about this Electoral College question, which I think ties to this, which is that, you know, I'm a little reticent to release the Electoral College in the United States because of the way that our population is parsed. It would mean the loss of the Electoral College would mean a total popular vote, which means that like large areas dominate the vote. The Electoral College does do something to balance out our regionalism. Now, what is also key is that we improve our voting systems. So we see this year, New York City, Alaska, and I think I'm leaving someone out, are using, for example, even in SB 202, now military folks will use ranked choice voting, right? When they, because of that shortened period of time between the general and the election. Now, innovations like this and/or requiring that a candidate get more than 50% of the vote in any kind of primary or election, right? I'm saying we want to improve the ability of a person's vote to do work and to convey the needs that they want. And we want to adjust our voting systems so that I might not get everything I want, but I am able to use my vote more powerfully than I am right now with a single shot vote to convey who I want and be able to elect somebody who I know has me in mind. Right now, the United States stands with lots of pockets of people who are not represented at all because of the way the districts are drawn and because it's single shot, single member districts. And so there's work to do in terms of proportional voting, ranked choice voting, this 50% requirement that I'm talking about. I'm saying there are innovations that can be made that give each individual person more power and they'll see their communities get representation, unlike now.
Jalen?
And to try to answer Dr. Adams' question, I think that internationally, young Black people thirst for one thing, and that's opportunity. And I think that opportunity comes in different forms depending on where you are. So the concern for a lot of people in my demographic is, you know, student loan debt, or, just opportunities to essentially live the American dream. Like, the opportunity to attain wealth, to, be a productive member of society. And in a lot of places internationally, I think that younger people are just left out of the conversation. So it's kind of like the laws that are being made now necessarily won't affect the people living now. It'll affect the people living and operating 10 years from now. And I think we just want to be a part of the people that make those laws, because then we know how to navigate that space when we get there. So one of the biggest topics across the country is financial literacy. What does that look like? I'm not sure, but I think that it's all a common consensus that, we just want to be able to live our lives, live up to the American dream, quote unquote, and, just have opportunities that necessarily our parents didn't have when they were 20 or when they were 25. So, it's just kind of, I look at it like this. It's kind of like we were given the torch at -5 and we got it to 0. But even though we made 5 steps forward, you're still at 0. So it's like, we just want to honestly and truly level the playing field. Like, you start here. So what all your gains are just, gains that you can use towards the future. Not saying I gave you 20%, but I had to make up 5. So I'm only at 15. It's just like other communities, they got 20%, they got the whole 20. But it's like, Black people, unfortunately, they have portions of that. So everyone talks about equality, but we don't talk about equity. And I think that's, the conversation that needs to be had across the country. It's opportunity, and then the opportunity to actually seize the entire opportunity.
So let me challenge you, Jalen, and others in our talk, because the conversation still is, and we have it in South Africa as well, of the individualistic advancement of the young, who on the tarred road that was set for those before them, it's still buying into the idea that there's an individual need to advance and that we can then benefit from the opportunities that are created on the table. If one looks at it in a wider sense, and I'm asking our panelists to give us their view on this, that should we not be thinking about more collective action for the marginalized and vulnerable across our contexts, and that have those connect with each other, so that we don't go along with the same rules of individual advancement for oneself, but that there's maybe a collective advancement of communities who are generally the poorest of the poor. All of us here in this webinar are a privileged group who managed to get, and in a South African context, we were able to get education and a tertiary education. Dr. Karim, myself, all of others are first generation who have managed to come through the apartheid system and get a first generation, be able to be educated. But there are people who, and communities for whom this will never be a reality. So, is there a change of do we need a different social system? Do we need a little socialism, which everyone worries so much about in the US? What's your thoughts on this, Zach and Dr. Jones and Jalen and other panelists?
So, I actually I just wrote a paper about Karl Marx's idea of capitalism and Du Bois' idea of capitalism. And Dr. King, said himself that Dr. King said himself that, Black people will not be liberated by any ism. So I think that unfortunately, a lot of young people, we think that if we have X amount of money, certain problems don't affect us anymore. And that's not necessarily the case. But I just have to be realistic. I think that a lot of young people's dreams lie in the journey to attain wealth. And necessarily why, I don't know. But I do think that there is a communal sense of, everyone doing things together. So one of the things that I think are very popular now is, in America, we had Black Wall Street, which was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I think that you now see these resurgence of ideas of true community development, like true community wealth building that future generations can use to attain their wealth. And although I don't have I wish I had the answer to the problem. I do think there's a balance between the two. I do think that if individuals feel like they have attained something, then overall the community will do better.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Jones, Dr. Karim?
I'm optimistic right now, especially after this year of protest, which Mr. Curry was explaining was so invigorating for people. I think it is community driving. I think it's also true that we do have an individualistic approach, which is to some degree by design, right, in the United States, to keep people feeling as if they do need to be independently wealthy as opposed to doing something for community. So I think that there is a lot of work for us to do in terms of making communities. And I think, ironically, that segregation, integration caused us a problem, right? Because you have a Black Wall Street because the place is segregated. And so people are sort of forced to synergize and make a community. Whereas after 1970, when you start to integrate, what you do is dissipate people's power, right? You're sending Black kids to white schools where they're not getting the kind of support that they need. So those of us who manage to, get these educations, that's not without some inherent perils. And so, I haven't thought a lot about this, but I feel like we should encourage people to build community. I also just think generally in the United States that we are ailing as a result of alienation, right? Suburbanization is a problem. People are out in these suburbs by themselves. And people do much better in these little tiny close-knit communities where there's childcare and psychological care and everyone's eating because somebody got something. And so I think America has some work to do before we're going to be able to bring that kind of community synergy to bear. But I keep pointing out to people that the reason that we got that George Floyd decision, which is not system changing, is because the whole world participated, the entire world.
Razak?
Thank you. I think the challenge is, I think Dr. Jones kind of, in a sense, picks up, she says she's optimistic, and standing afar, I'm also optimistic. But I also want to sound a word of caution that this is the moment where there's a lot of mobilization around voter suppression, violence against Black people. The challenge is, how do we move from the particularistic struggle to a more universal struggle? So that, and I'm not saying it's not taking place, but I think that is the big challenge for us. So that in mobilizing against voter suppression, how do we link it up to other issues so that we broaden the struggle, we bring in we broaden the coalition, because people will come in at the level of, say, a moral revulsion against voter suppression, others from a different perspective, but then they can link it to the issues around marginalization and how we can collectively address not just the voter suppression issue, but also how do everybody gets access to the basic necessities of life. And I think one of the things that struck me looking from South Africa during COVID, how many people slipped down the cracks and are at food pantries and soup kitchens. Same thing in South Africa. And so how do we make those links? How do we broaden it? And I think that is the big challenge for us. So in saying that, I want to sound the word of caution. I'm not saying we should become pessimistic. And so we need to maintain, there's a nice saying by Antonio Gramsci that we need to have a dialectical relationship between the pessimism of the world and the optimism of the intellect. And I think that is the challenge for us, is how do we at this moment when there is a level of mobilization, a strong level of mobilization, how do we sustain it? And how do we sustain it in such a way that we come back to what took place in the past of Occupy Wall Street, about the 1% and the 99%. It's a metaphor, but I think it aptly describes exactly, or what we speak about the insiders and the outsiders, exactly the same thing, is how do we deepen democracy to beyond simply the vote? And I think, so while we may have the vote or mobilize against voter suppression, how do we link it to these broader demands so we can think about and inculcate new ideas? Because in a sense, we live in a hegemonic system, right? Where, as Dr. Jones highlighted, is that we live in a society that kind of shapes us to think about the individual, about individual upliftment. How do we come back and say, what was it like 20, 30 years ago during the civil rights movement? So it's nothing new. How do we challenge this hegemonic notion that we have to move up ourselves? Can we go back to the time when, say, the Black Panther Party, there was a much more communitarian aspect. Of course, the Black Panther Party has been painted in as a violent movement, etc., etc. What do we draw from them? Or what do we draw from other movements? I think of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. Steve Biko organized around the idea around how do we mobilize, how do we re-engage with community. So he's developed all these community programs, Black community programs. He was a doctor, he studied to be a medical doctor, but of course couldn't finish, and of course died in detention. And so in a sense, when we think of Steve Biko and others who've given their lives for much more communitarian, and yeah, I don't want to romanticize the past, but I think we can learn a lot from the past and adapt it to the present, so that we looked at the community in a different way. But for that to happen, we really need to connect these, what some people say, militant particularisms in different communities. How do we bring them together so that they gain power and strength? And in a sense, that way, really change the dynamic where voting is not based on how much money you have, but more importantly, how voting can actually deepen democracy, because essentially that's what it should be, where we should participate in community development in our neighborhoods, so that it's not sort of put out for the representative, you know? So maybe, so I think it's a sort of a challenge for all of us, not just in the US, but South Africa and elsewhere as well. How do we move back to a society that values the community? But more importantly, how can, if you think of, say, the New Deal, the talk about the Green New Deal is essentially referring to that actually there's a role for the state and there's a role for society. And how under neoliberalism that has been undone. So I think our challenge is to speak to the younger generation and share experience, to say actually this whole idea of upward mobility for oneself wasn't always the case. It has been hegemonized. And so our challenge is, in the Gramscian sense, is how do we build the counter movement to that? And that takes place at level in the streets, but also at the level of ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. Can I invite some final comments from Dr. Jones, Jalen, from you, before we just do our ceremonials and kiss and say goodnight? Jalen, final comments on your side?
I just want to, thank everyone for listening today. I think it's very important for young people to get involved in these conversations, because we are the future. And we might not listen, but we do look to the past, and we do learn from those who come before us. So it is much appreciated with, inviting me on this talk today.
And I really want to thank you for joining us and bringing the kind of bigger, fiery conversations and thoughtfulness that you brought. It reminds me of a younger Dr. Karim. So it's very nice to see. there's a comment from Gibson Johnson that my students and I reached Steve Biko this semester in Paddle. The battle between the Black conscious movement in South Africa and Black Power movement and Pan-Africanism in the US. Amazing panel, this global discussion, important. Thank you all. Thank you, Kipton, appreciate that. You may want to, as part of a guest lecture, invite Dr. Karim, who's been involved in the Black conscious movement and would have a good historical perspective that may be able to, he can share. Also working in organizations that were active in the Black conscious movement at that time. Thank you for accepting, Dr. Karim, to do that. Dr. Jones?
I think that this conversation's focus on community is important. One of the things that I fear as a political development here is the removal of the franchise as the way people make choices. Because since the voter suppression is not working, it seems to me that their next step will be to end elections. So I think that this idea that we need to start thinking from a more community perspective, especially in this neoliberal world, is really critical. And so I'm going to start thinking about what I've got to say about how we synergize that, because you know, otherwise people are going to die and they're not going to get the kind of representation that they need. So I appreciate being a part of this discussion. I look forward to the opportunity to come to South Africa and learn about the franchise from there and more about the Black consciousness movement. So just thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Jan, hand over to you before I just make one final comment.
Did Dr. Curry get to make a final comment? So I wanted to make sure he had an opportunity if he wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry,
My
Dr.
apologies. I missed. I know you made a comment, but just to close out, if you had something to say.
Sure. Just to say thank you for the opportunity to present and to hear the different perspectives and different views and the comments from the chat box. So really important. Maybe just one final thing I want to say. And so in a sense, it comes back to I think again to Steve Biko and in his comment about the most important weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I think I touch on it to kind of highlight the importance of, for us, if we are to make change, to challenge inherited ideas, how hegemonic ideas become common sense. And people like Steve Biko basically guide us to think about how do we create alternative ideas that challenges this whole sense of individualizing, or to say that the market is the only way to organize society. To kind of say, actually, that's not true. How do we come back and, in a sense, re-embed the market in society, which it was always. And so I think that's our challenge. So we can create community. We can live in more cooperative terms in a much more egalitarian society, so that we don't have in South Africa children dying before the age of 5 because they don't have enough food. And so in that sense, I think it's important that hegemonic ideas need to be challenged. And I think it is through these small struggles that we can come together and really try and make this make change, you know. Thank you.
So I want to just thank everyone for participating today. I'm so grateful to have been able to listen to this and benefit from this. And one of the things that's just so clear to me from this first opportunity is the need for this discussion across continents, and that is inclusive in a way that helps us clarify. For me, this is clarifying. And I worry often about what I perceive as sort of the capitalistic framework for everything in the United States and the impact that it has on our humanity and our capacity to function in a way that works in the best interest of all. And so I think we need more of this conversation. I'm grateful for it, and grateful to Dr. Bawa for just getting us started with this, and for all that the University of the Western Cape did to make this possible today. So thank you.
And in keeping with that, I'd like to ask Graham Julies, firstly to thank everyone who's participated here. The chat box is on fire with our attendees. Thank you, colleagues. Hope we can do a lot more of this. And then also to ask Graham Julies, thank the panelists who've just been fantastic. And then to ask Graham Julies, if you can please, we can see your screen. And say to you, Graham, thank you very much for all the backup, all the support. Appreciate it very much.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And then just finally to just thank all the people who've come in from the various continents, Annalise, Margriet, our staff in the attendees who are here. Thank you all very much. And two things I just want to say before we leave. One is that we have a plan to continue these conversations. And so after the students are on the summer break and return, then back to class, we will set up a second series of engagements. If there are ideas that you have that you think we need to focus on, which would be relevant topics, because we're really quite keen to have students and staff present in the same sessions, because it models for us the way that both Morehouse and UWC want to do things. To just send those ideas, suggestions for topics, suggestions for talking to Jan Adams or us at UWC, and between us, we will make sure that we take this torch, carry this torch forward. One of the things that I noted so strongly during the Black Lives Matter movement, which also resonated for us from the Black Consciousness movement struggle in South Africa against oppression, is that there's a common thread among oppressed people on the salient issues: food, security, water, basic health care. And I was quite touched by a picture that I saw where the people from Palestine, which is at the moment the country suffering great apartheid and occupation, that they had put together a solidarity campaign together with those struggling with the Black Lives Movement following George Floyd. And what it highlights for us is that I think while we building community, our community can also be global, because we have a lot of support and resonance. Like we in South Africa benefited from the tremendous push against apartheid from globally, in the same way in all the other struggles. We're in the US, the right wing in Belgium, the neo-Nazi movement, the occupation in Palestine, or the suppression in Myanmar. All of these were those like-minded people who are fighting for freedom and democracy and for the global good can connect together, and we support each other, because the forces that are there, the anti-democratic forces, are always going to be stronger than all of us. But what they don't have is they don't have our commitment on the ground that we will fight for the better tomorrow, which is what Jalen here epitomizes so very nicely. So as Frederick Douglass has told us, power concedes nothing without a demand. So a luta continua, the struggle continues. Colleagues, over to you, Jan, Janine, and Prof. Shin for the final word.
Thank you all. We're grateful. We're grateful to the panelists and for everyone who attended today. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Umesh. Thank you.
Janine?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
And
Thank
Janine has
you.
committed
Thank
to
you.
do a full keynote at the next talk. So Janine, thank you very much.
Yes. And
Thank
have
you,
a good day tomorrow.
Curry.
Thank
Amandla.
you. Yes.
Amandla,
Love it.
go away.
Bye-bye.
Go well.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, thank you very much. I appreciate
Take care.
it. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.